again, I'm speaking just for Bismarck, it could vary in some other places. And part of that goes back to with the Cottage Food Act, if you will, a legislation that was recently passed. One thing that was a part of it, what said, basically stated that the local health units cannot make their requirements more restrictive. Which is a little bit, I mean, with the food code that regulates like licensed facilities, we have the option of doing that. We have to be as restrictive as the State Department of Health, and if we want to be more restrictive, we can. So that was one thing that was put in there, so it's gonna be uniform, when it's all hammered out and finalized, you know,
Which is something we didn't have before.
So farm eggs in Bismarck, farm flock eggs as you were calling them, can you sell them to the public? Absolutely. And then I guess I should kind of clarify two things, like if you're just a flock producer and you wanna sell them to the public at a farmer's market, or not even a farmer's market. Maybe you get permission from a gas station to sell the eggs in front of the gas station. Not in the gas station, which is technically a licensed facility, but clearly independent off on the side. You can do that. You don't have to be licensed here in Bismarck to do so. We do allow that. Do the eggs have to be maintained refrigerated? No. In fact, that was actually something we changed. Initially, we were requiring the eggs to be kept refrigerated. And after looking into it and hearing some of the argument, I guess you could say, for not requiring refrigeration and learning that there's this bacterial bloom on the eggs which acts as a protectant. And you know that eggs can actually be farm flock eggs at room temperature for, you know, anywhere from 21 days to maybe even possibly 30. And then also take into consideration that we think, you know, if we're telling people they have to refrigerate them, and here they're getting the eggs, and they're not refrigerating when they have them at their farm, but they're throwing them in the refrigerator when they bring them to the farmer's market, it's a little bit disingenuous. So we don't require them to be refrigerated if you're gonna sell them directly to the public. If you're gonna sell them to a licensed establishment, a food establishment, a grocery store, you can do that if you're licensed with the North Dakota Egg Department. You'd have to go through that process. And they, from what I understood, will require you to wash the eggs as well as keep them refrigerated.
And I think they require candling.
They do require candling as well, correct. That, by the way, it was mentioned at another part with the eggs, or maybe it wasn't mentioned because I think we kind of skipped it, you know, is voluntary. With the exception if you're gonna go do it, sell your eggs to a licensed food establishment, then you have to abide by that. But even if you didn't want to sell them to a licensed food establishment, you're only gonna sell them directly to the public, it's a voluntary program if you wish to do so.
So if you wash your eggs, you have to refrigerate them, right?
You would definitely want to refrigerate them because you're removing that bacterial coating which is actually protecting the egg. Funny enough, you know, it was a natural bacterial coating that's protecting it from other competitive organisms that could be problematic and cause foodborne illness.
Are there guidelines for washing those eggs?
I don't know what they are. I think the egg department might have some. So if you're going to get licensed with the egg department, I'm sure they do. I don't know offhand what they entail.
I will tell you, in the session we had in Minot, we had an egg producer there, and she had just gone through that. She'd never done it before, but she just went through the inspection thing, and she said, you know, the gentleman from the Department of Agriculture was so helpful. He showed her how to properly candle, and you know, it wasn't, oh, you don't know how to do it, you can't, you know, become licensed or whatever. It was more educational, she said, than anything, and it was really easy, and he was very helpful, and taught her a lot. And so, you know, don't be deterred by that at all, because she said it was a good process to go through, and she enjoyed it.
That's a great point. I mean, in my dealings with the egg department in that aspect, they really want to be there to help you, not to like, oh, you're doing it wrong, you can't do it. And to let you know, this is the right way of doing it. And I don't think it's overly difficult either. I think the fee they charge is very reasonable for what it is on hand.
Yeah, it was pretty low.
Yes. Any questions about eggs? Good. You can sell them pretty much any time. They don't have to require refrigeration unless you're going to start selling them to licensed food establishments, grocery stores, restaurants, etc. Then you have to be licensed with the egg department and meet all their requirements.
I have a question about eggs.
Yes.
Okay. So they are a very diverse small farm, and they have some eggs that they sell, and they do produce, and they also do baked goods. Can they use their farm flock eggs in their baked goods?
Using farm flock eggs for baked goods, so for the cottage food, no, I don't believe they can. I think it's similar to like raw milk. You have to use,
They could if they were licensed.
correct. That would be a
If they were
workaround, just go get
That's the
licensed with the egg
workaround, go
department.
get licensed
which
with the
doesn't
egg
take much
department,
to
and then
do.
you can use your eggs
Yep.
in your baked goods, okay.
Then you could.
What about family business? So like along the same lines, 15-year-old son of ours fully runs his own flock. We have nothing to do with it, our own stuff. So could I buy my eggs from him and then make my banana bread for my cottage pot?
If he's licensed with the egg department.
Cause then he is, as long as he's licensed, he can sell it to
Because
the
he's
licensed,
not
he can sell it to restaurants,
It would
but
be
he
no different
could.
than if he was selling to the public at any
Exactly.
time without, could I be his public?
So you're
Oh.
talking about making that banana bread just for yourself, or you're talking about taking
No.
banana bread and selling it
Selling.
as a cottage food?
So if you have two separate business entities under the same roof is what I'm asking.
Under the same roof, two separate business entities, it's not gonna matter, what's going to matter is his flock and his egg business licensed? If it's licensed, then yes, you can use his eggs in your banana bread and your baked goods.
On that same note, can I ask, like, say that my neighbor loves making salsa. They've got this awesome recipe. She buys her tomatoes from me as a farmer's market, whatever, or cottage farmer. She can't do that then?
Yes, she can. Because remember, whole, uncut produce is good across the board. So as long as you don't cut those tomatoes up for her, you sell her the whole uncut tomatoes, that's okay. Whole, uncut produce is okay. It is, you are considered an approved source to sell to restaurants, grocery stores, home consumers, somebody who's making salsa, as long as it's whole, uncut.
That's the way I view it too. So, I mean, bear in mind, there's really technically a difference between produce, whole uncut produce, and cottage food, shelf-stable baked goods, canned pickled items. You know, there's a difference insofar as we've allowed the produce to be sold at farmers markets and even outside of farmers markets for a long time. The cottage food is more relatively a new thing, of being able to manufacture these foods outside of a licensed facility and sell them to the public. So, and actually, I think that's the next slide here. Boom.
I know, but they have it on their handouts, so.
Okay, produce. I'm not gonna just read this off. Can you, as a grower, sell produce to the public in Bismarck without a license? The answer is yes. You can. If you're the one growing it and it's whole, intact, unprocessed produce, you can sell it anytime to the public. Just, you can sell it at the farmer's market, you can sell it at, again, I'll use the example of a gas station. I know that happens where people have a bunch of corn in the back of the truck and they get permission from the gas station to pull
Or
up and just sell
pumpkins.
corn. Yep, anything. Apples, you name it, as long as it's whole, intact, uncut produce, not a problem. Can you sell that produce, whole, intact, uncut produce, to food establishments, to restaurants, to grocery stores? And the answer is yes, you can. You can without a license as well. There's a couple lines here that apply to that though.
Must be unadulterated and protected from contamination.
Yep, that's a big one right there. I mean, that's kind of a no-brainer. Irrigation practices, application of biological soil amendments such as age or composted manure, yada yada yada. Must be consistent with good agricultural practices, in addition to having potable water supply that meets the requirements of the North Dakota Drinking Water Program. So you have to meet that requirement if you're gonna sell to licensed food establishments. You don't necessarily have to meet that requirement if you're just gonna sell to the public.
Let me point out one thing on this one though, Anton, maybe you can, it's up here, the second bullet point, you said produce means any fruit or vegetable and includes mushrooms. Doesn't the state guideline say cultivated mushrooms fine, wild sourced mushrooms not.
Yep, that's an excellent point. You nailed it. I mean, if you're it's a difference between growing the mushrooms, which you can do, versus someone going out and essentially hunting for mushrooms that you can't do. And then I thought I had something maybe to the next slide about sprouts.
That's in there.
It's in the middle.
Food license is required for those who wish to grow and sell sprouts.
Yeah, sprouts, as you kind of talked about before, are just, you look at the growth process of a sprout, a seed that comes out of the dirt, that has covered with bacteria, an environment that's filled with bacteria. If you remember your initial slide that you had up with that big pie chart, sprouts made up 25% of the foodborne outbreaks. The other 25% was the cut leafy green or the lettuce, if I recall correctly. So sprouts are considered a potentially hazardous food or a time temperature controlled food for the purpose of food safety. And even like a licensed food establishment, if they wanted to start growing or producing their own sprouts that they were gonna use, they would have to get a variance through us to do so. They're gonna wanna know exactly, how you're gonna do this to ensure that it's done in a safe and proper way. Questions at this time? And if you have any questions, throw and go back, of course, too. Items that can be sold without a food license, honey. We do allow for the sale of honey, maple syrup, cottage foods, commercially processed, prepackaged, shelf-stable foods, so candies, pop, bottled water. Just what else I can add to that? The cottage foods we've already talked about. I've mentioned this term before, but TCS food, TCS stands for time temperature control food for the purpose of food safety. It used to be called in our food code a potentially hazardous food, and even before that it was called a perishable food. But basically a food that requires refrigeration for the purpose of food safety, and if not refrigeration, not that temperature control and some sort of time control. You need a food license in Bismarck if you're going to sell a TCS food. That's just kind of where one of the thresholds are. Once you cross this line, now you're looking at a food license. So like the example I gave of the individual that was selling, like taking their lettuce that they grew and was chopping it up. Now they've crossed that threshold because cut leafy greens are considered a TCS food. Now you're having to have a food license to do so. The other thing too, even if it's a non-TCS food, it doesn't require time or temperature control. If you're going to process it, whether you're going to process it on site or process it elsewhere, and I'm trying to think of a good example of that. I mean, this is a very simplistic one, but like if someone is selling, I don't want to use that one.
I went down to Florida on vacation, and I was amazed, of course, because you know what I do on vacation, I hit every farmer's market I can hit, right? And I was amazed of all the stands at the farmer's markets that were making guacamole right there. They had their avocados, they were chopping them up, they were, mixing up their salsa or their guacamole right there on the spot. That would be, we're not gonna make guacamole up here, maybe not, but, that would be processed by the food vendor on site.
That'd be a good example. Actually the guacamole, after you process it's gonna be considered TCS, going to require refrigeration or temperature control. But if somebody was gonna make, like let's say candy apples on site, would be an example. If someone was gonna make their roasted nuts on site, I was gonna use the example of lemonade. And that's not the best example to use because if you go like to a street fair in downtown here, we do license like lemonade vendors. But at the same time, if there's a kid on the corner selling lemonade, we've allowed that. We don't want to make headlines shutting down the lemonade stand like it's happening.
That was raising money for the cancer kid.
Exactly. And the reason we've allowed that is because it's a kid selling lemonade, because it's not, it's seen as an exception to the rule. It's gonna be a little bit different if mom or dad set up this gourmet lemonade stand and now it's open.
And it's there every day,
It's there every
all
day.
the time.
Yep. There would be at some point, if something like that happened, okay, now you're looking at crossing the line and we're gonna have to get licensed for it. But if there's any sort of preparation done on site, this would be practical, but obviously like with the cottage foods and like a baking of an apple pie, you can obviously do that. You can do that at your home, you meet the rest of the requirements with the labeling, the posted notice, the allergen warning and whatnot, fine. But if you wanted to somehow bake the apple pie on site, you're gonna have to be licensed to do that. You couldn't bake the apple pie, now you're going through the process of manipulating all these things. We're gonna wanna make sure it's done in a healthy, safe environment.
Making pico de gallo, you're taking your tomatoes and things and cutting onions and peppers and cutting them, making pico de gallo right there on site.
Can you remind me how long the license lasts again? Cause like we have to buy a food license for what we do.
In Bismarck, ours are good for a year.
A year, okay.
Yep. Actually, the deadline is March 31st of the year.
Anton's example, just to throw in another little piece, is to also remember if you're selling your apple pie by the slice instead of the whole, and you're selling it with your little napkins and a utensil, that's now a ready-to-eat food and it is now also taxable. So where you were not collecting tax before, you also would have to remember to collect tax.
And if you do it for a short period of time, you can get shorter tax things too, so like when we sell our food, ready-to-eat food.
Yep.
You only apply for like a 6 month or whatever it is.
Right, so you don't have to do it every year, all year, right?
I guess something I'll add to this too, if you're gonna sell any meats have to be, you know, USDA or state egg inspected, with the exception of the chicken. You know, if you're the flock producer of the chicken and it's a whole, uncooked chicken.
Whole
that-
frozen.
Whole frozen, that's allowed.